on coming out, listening to music, bring a snack or a drink. Probably lawn chair would be good too. Or we'll be hanging out there at the Elder's house for a while, doing some tunes this afternoon. And Gina, it's good to have you back after that vacation. That was a rough start, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Here I was, all primed for Mother's Day. The Lord had impressed it on me days before Mother's Day to have a Mother's Day sermon. It never dawned on me till Justin was doing call to worship. This is Father's Day. Father's Day sermon. What's up with that? And I'm noticing the big difference in numbers here today too. Dads, we didn't quite pull it off like the mothers did. We were crammed on Mother's Day. We just don't quite have the clout that moms do at singing, but like Justin said, dads are pretty important too. And Jillian, I didn't know I was going to need a box of Kleenex on Father's Day either. That's all fair. I hope Willow don't do that to me when she gets a little bit older. Works younger than she does. Oh boy. The message can apply to dads, though. Good message today. Good message. We're taking up the story of Joseph. After a little detour into the saga of the life of Judah and seeing how the two are working together in God's providence to bring about the Messiah. A lot of potential lessons today. After about my third try, I zeroed in on what I wanted to talk about. Took 3 crumpled papers before I decided, yeah, I think this is where I want to go. Joseph had the blessing of God on his life. You want that? I want that. How do we get it? And what is the blessing of God? Let's read chapter 39, and we'll work on some thoughts out of there as we grapple with this idea. In the world, we get this idea in our mind of what is success. Elijah and I were talking about that coming over this morning. If we look around us, we can picture in our human way what we think successful people look like. They have a certain level of livelihood, or a certain amount of toys, or a certain way of dressing, a certain amount of money in the bank account. All these things we measure success by. But as we grapple what success is biblically, we're going to see it's quite different. Let's read 39. Let's read 39. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man. There's our word. He's a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. Then he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had he put under his authority. So it was from the time that he had made him overseer of his house and all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in all the field. Thus he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he did not know what he had except for the bread which he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph, and she said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he has to my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you. Because you are his wife, how then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" So it was as she spoke to Joseph day by day that he did not heed her to lie with her or to be with her. And it happened about this time when Joseph went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was inside, that she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. And so it was when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and fled outside, that she called to the men of her house and spoke to them, saying, "See, he has brought us in a Hebrew to mock us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And it happened when he heard that I lifted my voice and cried out, that he left his garment with me and fled and went outside. So she kept his garment with her until his master came home, and then she spoke to him with words like these, saying, The Hebrew servant whom you brought to us came in to me to mock me. So it happened as I lifted my voice and cried out, that he left his garment with me and fled outside. So it was when his master heard the words which his wife spoke to him, saying, Your servant did to me after this manner, that his anger was aroused. Then Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in the prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy, and he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did there, it was his doing. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. So Joseph was a successful man. In verse 2, the Lord tells us that. Success is alluring. We have a human built-in innate attraction to being successful, it seems. It puts images in our mind. And the Bible says Joseph was successful. Even humanly, as we think of it. He had a certain level of livelihood. He was good looking. He had power and prestige. But is that the success that we're thinking about this morning? I want to go deeper into the idea of what is biblical success. We know all about human success. It's here for a moment and then gone as quickly as it came. We want something more lasting and more meaningful, surely, if we're thinking of the idea of biblical success. It's hidden in our passage some 4 times. Even snuck in there in verse 2 where it says he was a successful man. Look how verse 2 starts. The Lord was with Joseph. That's our key right there to biblical success. The Lord was with Joseph. Look at verse 3. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all he did to prosper in his hand. 21. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy, and he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. 23. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority, because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. That, my friends, is biblical success. Having the Lord with you. Having the Lord with you wherever you are. Again, look at verse 2. He was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. Now look at verse 20, doing a little contrast here. Then Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. Was the Lord with Joseph in one place but not the other? Oh, we need to go on one verse, don't we? But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy, and he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. So he went from Potiphar's house, quite a place of prestige, to the lowly prison. But the Lord's presence followed Joseph from one to the other. Success is not where you are, but whether God is with you where you are. I want to say that again. Success is not where you are, but whether God is with you where you are. Doesn't matter if you're in the prestigious mansion or the lowly prison cell. Success is whether or not God is with you, and He'll be working in your life wherever you are to prosper you. That's success. That's success. We need to wrap our minds around that. Think about Paul's prison letters. If we do a little research, we learn that Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians, and Philemon were written from Paul's prison experience. Was God with Paul? Oh, He surely was. Those were some of the best written pieces of writing in the Word of God, but yet written from a prison experience. God was definitely with Paul. Worldly success, as I mentioned, is so fickle, slipping away in a minute. But if you have the Lord with you, you have something that can't be taken. That's so important, church, no matter where this life takes you, whatever happens, if you have the Lord, it can't be taken away. And I'm thinking what makes some people be able to endure horrible circumstances, like Corrie ten Boom and people like that who have come through the Nazi concentration camps and so forth. Some will buckle under the pressure and go to pieces and lose it mentally, but others will excel and be able to come through. What's the difference? I think at least part of it has to be the Lord's presence in here, giving you hope, giving you something to live for and fight for, and the promise that tomorrow will be better, that things will get better. And if we have the Lord with us, it goes in a lot of different directions. Think about these things. You have the blessing of the Lord, which we're wrapping our minds around. We have the presence of the Lord with us. We have the enabling of the Lord, and we have the providence of the Lord as He gives us what we need. I want to think about that providence of the Lord just for a moment as we think about our lives. Turn with me over to John chapter 6. I want to do a little reading here. It's a little bit longer passage. I'll break into this story. About verse 11, I think, will give us the gist of what I'm looking for. And Jesus took the loaves. Right away, you get that mental image of what we're talking about here. Hungry people, multitudes, limited resources. But our Lord took the loaves. And when He had given thanks, He distributed them to the disciples, and the disciples to those sitting down, and likewise of the fish as much as they wanted. And when they were filled, He said to His disciples, gather up the fragments that remain, so nothing is lost. Therefore they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves, which were left over by those who had eaten. And then these men, when they had seen the sign that Jesus did, said, this is truly the prophet who is to come into the world. A few loaves and a few fishes. Fishes, I think that was the wrong English there, or what? But the Lord took those and made much of them. If the Lord is with you, you have the providence of the Lord to supply the need of the moment in your life. Another one of these quotes. Got some good ones today. The meeting of the need is not dependent on the supply at hand, but on the blessing of the Lord resting on the supply. You catch that? I'll read it again. If you're like me, your mind works slow. The meeting of the need is not dependent on the supply at hand, but on the blessing of the Lord resting on the supply. He can take little and make much in a lot of different ways. Maybe you experienced that in your life. Maybe you had more a month at the end of the money than you thought should be there, and you're thinking, Lord, how are we going to make it? But you did. The Lord's hand rested on the supply. Pastor Nell of Hong Kong Underground Church defines God's blessing as being out of proportion to our efforts. In other words, he takes what human effort we can do, but the blessing is poured upon it. Have you ever experienced that? How God's blessing is just so overwhelming, you have to say, that was from the Lord. Beyond anything that I could have humanly done. Sometimes we see that in folks around us. Rhonda's an astute observer of the Mennonite culture. And she says, how do they get to be so prosperous? I think it's the hand of the Lord, the blessing of the Lord on their lives. They have strong convictions. A few instances pop out in my mind of the conviction of the Amish and Mennonite people that I've been associated with years ago. A lot of you know Wendy Waite, and Wendy was a good friend of mine, and we were fellow crafters at that time, and Wendy gets the bright idea. She says, Curt, my brother is having this log cabin, log home building show up in Columbus. Let's go together and get a booth up there, and we'll make a lot of money. Anytime that promise is tacked on, we'll make a lot of money. Caution sign, better go up. Okay, Lindy, that sounds like a good idea to me. It was like a February show, in the middle of the winter when things are slow anyway. And Rhonda and I, we were about to starve out at that particular time in our life, and we needed that show really bad. So here Wendy and I go blundering up into Columbus. I could barely find the place, set up at the log home builder show, and right across from us was this group of Amish builders, which that's quite a story in itself, but that's probably better suited for another time. I'll get in storytelling mode and then I'll never finish my sermon. But anyway, we got to talking with these Amish guys, and the booth fee was expensive. It was like $600-700. You know what happened on Sunday? No Amish people showed up to run their booth. That's the conviction I'm talking about. Pay $600-700 for a 2-day show. You'd think you'd want to be there, wouldn't you? To get business? Where were they? Honoring their Lord. That's the conviction I'm talking about in the Mennonite culture. They have their standards go a little different than ours. By the freedom of Christ, I was there in my booth. They weren't. But they're prosperous. I think God honors that kind of integrity. And he did Joseph, which we're going to get to in a little bit. But God's blessing sometimes is out of proportion to our effort when his hand is upon our lives. We've seen that. I know 2 different people who very probably unintentionally begin to take care of an elderly neighbor. Just take them food, take care of them, and it might have grew and they get older, taking them to the doctors. You know what happened with these 2 people I'm talking about? When their elderly neighbor died, they give them their farm. That's the hand of God on a person. I don't think they had any intentions of getting a farm when they begin to take a meal down the road to the neighbor. That's God's blessing, that devotion in our life to doing what He would have us to do. Blesses often out of proportion. Think of Joseph going from the pit to running Potiphar's house. That's a big proportionate gain in lifestyle there, isn't it? The prison cell to being ruler over Egypt. That's a big proportionate lifestyle change right there. Had to be God. Had to be God. So if we have the Lord with us, we have the blessing of God, the presence of God, the enabling strength of God, and the providence of God. God was with Joseph for his calling. Now listen up, church. Here's something important. What's your calling? Might not be as prominent as Joseph's. We're not going to be ruler over Egypt. I'm probably not going to be ruler over Homer Township. At least I hope not. I'll leave the politics to Terry. He can run Malta. I don't want any politics. Our calling might not be prominent at all. It might be a very quiet, behind-the-scenes servant of God mowing the church yard. Somebody who the public may never see. But is God with you? Look back to that idea of biblical success. If God is with you in that calling that He's asked you to do, it's a success. It's a success. So how do we attain this biblical form of success? That might be going through your mind. I'm always practical. I want to know how and why. How did Joseph get it? How did he get the presence of God in his life? And I think there's some hints. There's some hints as we look at the story of Joseph this morning. There's this thing called attitude. You have a bad attitude. You ever heard that? Maybe you've told your kids that. Your attitude stinks. Or, that's a good attitude. We can have good attitude, bad attitude, or outlook on life may be another way. Attitude is defined as a settled way of thinking or feeling about someone or something reflected in a person's life. So as we look at Joseph, where do you think his attitude was? Was the glass half empty or half full? Overall, it was pretty good. It was pretty good, and I think that has at least a part of what's going on with God blessing our lives. Our attitude affects our whole life. Joseph's attitude, for the most part, was, and we know that all things work together for good to those that love God, to those called according to His purpose. It was Romans 8:28 before it was even written. That was Joseph's attitude. And it didn't seem to waver. It kind of stayed stable, whether he was in the pit, or Potiphar's household, or the prison cell, or running Egypt. He was pretty stable. A conviction that God loved him and was working in his life. And it enabled him to walk by faith. Joseph seemed to think, even though I'm in a cistern, even though I'm a slave in Egypt, even though I'm in a jail cell, I will trust God. How about you? Are you in a cistern? A jail cell? A slave in Egypt? And if you are you trusting God for tomorrow? That's what we need to ask ourselves. God is working. All things work together for good to them we see attitude. But there's more. There's more. Look at 37:2. We're going to back up a chapter. It gives us another glimpse into Joseph's internal life. It reads, this is the history of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brothers, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah, his brothers, and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father. You know, we kind of skimmed over that verse when we preached through that chapter. What do we have here? Is it merely a verse illustrating Joseph being a tattletale? You know, we don't really like tattletales, do we? Or is there more? I think it shows us a devotion to the things of God. Those brothers were surely into something they didn't need to be doing. And it doesn't really explain to us what it was. If they were into the false gods or the foreign ladies of the land, I don't know what they were doing. But it was something that was worth telling Jacob about. So I think we see a glimpse of devotion to the things of God there in Jacob's life. Devotion leads us to holiness. If we're devoted to the things of God, you and I are going to be different than the world around us. We're going to be holy. And that leads to a heart change. A heart change. Let me show you something that popped out at me as I was putting this together. And I was thinking about Joseph and this devotion to God and the heart change and all those things. Listen to Matthew 5. Jesus begins to talk. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Kind of sounds like Joseph's life, doesn't it? And note, each one of those begins with blessed. And that's what we're looking at, the blessing of God. Or God being with us. Or God being our success. As we think of each one of those virtues there. If we pop back into our story there, do you see any of the pride, the spoiled little boy that was telling about the dreams of his brothers bowing down and all that? I can see that now. I see a mature young man that's handling the situation with a lot of poise and confidence and faith that his God is going to be seeing him through this. Two thoughts about the blessing of God as I wind down here, but they're worth sharing. God's blessing should be used as a witness to others. When God blesses us, use it as a platform to share. And we were talking about that back in Sunday school. You know how great it is when an athlete on the airwaves of the big TV channels gives the glory to God in a victory. And the platform they have to reach hundreds of thousands, millions of people using that. On a smaller scale, you and I need to use our victories anytime we can to point to, it was God's blessing upon my life that allowed me to do this. Joseph had something, and he didn't hide it. He didn't hide it. Look at verse 3. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all he did to prosper in his hand. And in verse 9, as he refutes the forward wife, He says, how then can I do this great wickedness and what? And sin against God? Any chance he had, he was using an opportunity to bring up God. Promotion, job success, notoriety, victory, use it to share Christ. Even when explaining why we can't do something. You know what, guys? I can't do this. I can't share in this activity because my God is a holy God. And I don't want to sin against him. Lastly, God's blessing is not necessarily related to favorable circumstances. Oh! We get that appearance thing going on, don't we? If everything's going well, God's favor must be upon us. Is it only when everything's going well that God is with us? We kind of alluded to that very briefly. Let's contrast verse 4 again. Joseph found favor in his sight and served him, and he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had he put under his authority. Things are going pretty well for Joseph. Look at verse 20. Then Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in the prison. What happened to God's blessing? Good, bad. But what's God's blessing still upon us? And we need to wrap our minds around that, church. We really struggle with that in our human way. It said God uses trials to shape and prepare us. Even when we're going, ouch, ouch, ouch. You know how when you put Scotch tape on your arm, you have to pull that off with all your hair, even when we're doing that in life. Ow! Lord, I don't want to experience that. God's blessing can still be there. It said Moses' life was divided into 3 40-year segments. 40 years of wanting to be somebody, 40 years of being a nobody, and 40 years of finally being somebody. What about those first 80 years? Was God's blessing not upon them? Oh, they were preparing him for what he was finally going to do, of being somebody. How about David's years when he was running from King Saul? Was that just a vacant time when God's presence was gone in David's life? Not at all. He was preparing him. Even Paul spent those years in Arabia. So if your circumstances are challenging to you today, never fear. God is here with you in your life. He's going to bring it. There will be tomorrow. There will be tomorrow. Success. God's blessing. Life. Big topics for us as we wrap our mind around God's wisdom. The Lord was with Joseph and he was a successful man. Dads, here's where it shifts to you. As men, we struggle with the idea of success. Appearances isn't everything. The question is God with you? Is God with you? In whatever stage of life you're at right now. Is God with you? That we've learned is biblical success and what we should be striving for. If you need God today, time of invitation. Take that first step toward a Savior to give his life, shed his blood, to cleanse us from sin and bring us back into a relationship with the Lord God. We invite you forward.